In November 2019, Kojima Productions released their first game as an independent studio, Death Stranding, a game marketed on the basis of its sumptuous graphics, star-studded cast, and, most importantly, its status as a Hideo Kojima project. A year after Death Stranding was announced, and with no sense at all yet of what the game might be, the president of Sony Interactive Entertainment America, Sean Layden, revealed that he had played an alpha build of Death Stranding, though he added, "I couldn't explain to you what the game is." After having played the finished version of Death Stranding for over 100 hours, I understand Layden struggled to explain it. In rough outline, Death Stranding is a cooperative single-player haunted stealth shooter and walking simulator. You play through Death Stranding as Sam Porter Bridges, a delivery man who hauls packages across the dystopian remains of the United Cities of America, following a supernatural nuclear equivalent event that has brought the dead in immediate, disastrous contact with the living. Sam delivers physical goods with the help of his bridge baby, or BB, a prenatal infant housed in a pod that is wirelessly connected to the womb of their brain-dead still mother, while simultaneously convincing the few Americans left alive to join the chiral network, a powerful internet connected by the beaches that unite the living world and the afterlife. If that sounds complicated already, it is. By almost any measure, playtime, map size, dialogue, musical score, budget, Death Stranding is massive, and its convoluted and exposition-heavy story is told in over 11 hours of cinematics and hundreds of emails, journal entries, and other pieces of storytelling ephemera. These extended text-based and non-interactive storytelling devices are not unique to Death Stranding. They are a hallmark of visual novels and full-motion video games, but they are remarkable in a AAA game with a $100 million budget. While walking simulators have been more recently embraced for their interactive narrative power, less than 10 years ago they were not considered games at all. Walking simulator was a derogatory term meant to imply that the game in question was but a simulator of directionless, pointless walking. Walking simulators are also, as Bonnie Ruberg notes in Straight Paths Towards Queer Walking Simulators and Video Games Have Always Been Queer, deeply connected to queer modes of play and queer storytelling. The queerness of the walking simulator and the willingness of some gamers to categorize it as something other than a video game are, of course, not unrelated to one another. Modern gaming is rife with queer kinds of play and queer and marginalized stories, mostly from smaller indie developers, but they are also met with a pervasive hostility from some vocal members of the community. We can see a version of this conflict in the disjunct between the non-conforming and deeply traditional elements that make up Death Stranding. While much of the game focuses on finding paths across difficult terrain, Death Stranding itself can never quite bridge the gap between its traversal-focused delivery gameplay and its bombastic, gun-heavy boss fights. Felix Zimmerman and Christian Hubert's recent article on walking simulators in game studies journal Press Start argues that atmospheric narrative games like 2012's Dear Esther and 2017's Tacoma should shake off the derogatory trappings of walking simulators as a term and instead be called ambience action games. While I cannot speak to the epistemological trappings of genre terminology, ambience action game evokes the feeling of playing Death Stranding more than any other genre term I've heard thus far. Death Stranding is oppressive ambience and thumping action, a reflection on the limits of gender normativity and soaked in male bravado, and neither the gameplay nor its queer and normative constructions of masculinity ever quite harmonize with one another. At certain points, Death Stranding revels in its difficulty and its difference from other games in its field, and at other times it falls back into the recognizable trappings of the gun and stealth-based shooters of the Metal Gear series that its creator, Hideo Kojima, helmed for over 30 years. While you can find a number of passionate and often conflicting opinions about Death Stranding, nearly all of them refer to Hideo Kojima as an auteur. This reaction is not undeserved, as Kojima is one of the few recognizable names in video game design, and his previous work has been praised for its involved stories, innovative gameplay, and high production values. However, whether we evaluate Death Stranding's merits in the language of the male-dominated video game industry or the male-dominated film industry, it is little surprise that the game's dystopian UCA is principally concerned with men and navigated by a male player avatar. Yet examining how Kojima presents Death Stranding as auteur masterpiece and how the game in turn communicates its message of connectivity and community to its players reveals how Kojima's reflections on male legacy and authorship surprisingly co-opts pregnancy to both transformative and discriminatory effect. The pregnancy motif in Death Stranding borders on overly obvious. Throughout the game, Sam delivers literal precious cargo with his BB physically tethered to his stomach via cybernetic umbilical cord. What may be less obvious is how much of Death Stranding's interest in pregnancy is baked into the gameplay and its portrayal of Sam's body. As Sam acquires cargo, his movement becomes increasingly precarious, and even seemingly stable terrain can be suddenly dangerous as Sam, and the player, adjust to his new, differently weighted frame. Movement is arduous in Death Stranding, and the game takes pains to dwell on the physical toll the deliveries take on Sam's body, many of which have holdovers to the effects of late-term pregnancy. Sam complains about his swollen and battered feet, and shower sequences dwell on the angry rashes that his backpack has cut into his shoulders. The marks resemble both impetigo herpetiformis, a rare disease triggered by pregnancy that resembles pustular psoriasis, and irritation from a bra strap. Sam's body is also notably covered in handprints, as his severe aphenophosophobia, fear of being touched, produces a handprint-shaped rash or bruise on his body. There is a literal connection to pregnancy here. Sensitivity to touch is a common side effect of pregnancy, and there are some cases of pregnancy that have been linked to allodynia, or severe pain or sensitivity to touch. However, the connection between these handprints and Sam's phobia more powerfully speak to a desire for Sam to control access to his body, and the game dwells on the invasive power of unwelcome hands. Allies unthinkingly touch Sam, and the beached things, or BTs, make their presence known by stomping handprints into the earth and along Sam's body and backpack. Friend and foe alike attempt to touch Sam's BB without his permission, speculate on their relationship, or criticize Sam's handling of it. Sam's body and bodily fluids, particularly his blood, urine, stool, and shower samples, are monitored and drawn from him upon entry into any safe house and rest area in the game. As the handprints that cover his body suggest, Sam does not own himself, nor his BB. Sam's physical attachment to his BB is further tied to the loss of his pregnant wife and unborn child prior to the game's opening. The loss is again encoded on his body. Sam has a cross-shaped cesarean scar on his stomach, as does Cliff, the ghostly remnant of a father searching for his own stolen BB to reclaim as his son. As Sam builds connections with the outside world, he also builds connections to his BB, who he eventually names Lou, including sequences where he soothes the child via rocking and singing. Without drifting too deeply into the weeds of Death Stranding's story, it is no surprise that the game's final delivery births the BB, now Lou, from its pod. While much of Death Stranding's world dwells on life and death more broadly, Sam's story is largely about parenthood and delivery. Within that framework, Death Stranding's conflicted playstyles can be mapped onto traditional and non-traditional ideas about masculinity, and opportunities for masculine bodies to occupy traditionally feminine spaces. While Sam is functionally immortal as a repatriate with the ability to return to life after death, he is also mechanically and narratively vulnerable to touch and dependent on the health and feelings of his BB Lou. Sam is traditionally masculine, but, as a pregnant body, also susceptible to the invasive dangers that are usually reserved for female characters, including extended nudity and the unwelcome zoom of the player's camera. And while the majority of the boss fights descend into epic gun battles or literal punch-outs, Death Stranding's ending asks Sam and the player to choose nonviolence and to deepen their human connections. Weeping for the dead and focusing on one's love for another person are integrated into the game as necessary steps to seeking resolution, and all of Death Stranding's characters, even the most emotionally reserved, are brought to tears in some form or another. Yet, I must return to BB's still mother, the comatose and functionally brain-dead woman who lurks outside of Sam and Lou's story. While Death Stranding asks its players to occupy the precarious body movements of pregnancy, it does so in a world where women very pointedly cannot give birth. With the exception of a minor character Sam never speaks with directly, the women of Death Stranding are largely beautiful but infertile. Lindsay Wagner's USC president, Bridget Strand, has uterine cancer. Leia Seydoux' package deliverer Fragile reveals that her body has deteriorated from the neck down. Twins, Lochna and Mama, both played by Margaret Qualley, are differently infertile. Lochna's uterus is incapable of carrying a baby, and Mama is unable to produce eggs. Their attempt to create a child together is stillborn and massively destructive. Journal entries reveal that Sam's wife Lucy committed suicide as a result of pregnancy-induced apocalyptic nightmares, and Amelie Strand, the impetus of Death Stranding's story and its final boss, exists as a frozen ghost and a literal extinction event. While the game takes pains to faithfully render images of these women on screen, they are denied the ability to create anything themselves. Even Fragile, the only female character who never expresses a desire for a biological child, cannot rebuild her package delivery business and is instead incorporated into Bridges. It is ultimately Sam's body, encoded with the impact and danger of his labors and deliveries, that is productive, connective, and playable. Death Stranding, in short, can only imagine a world where men imbue the world with new life and new modes of gender performance if women's creations are ultimately stillborn. And it is here, in this moment where we mediate on a world without female creation, that I ask that we return to thinking about Death Stranding as a meditation on Kojima as auteur. As I've noted briefly already, Death Stranding is in many ways the culmination of Kojima's achievements to date, and its rigorous attention to recreating the movement and framing of a live-action film begs for the game, and Kojima's direction, to be placed in conversation with cinema, in addition to, or perhaps instead of, AAA gaming. The game's star-studded cast includes Norman Reedus as protagonist Sam Bridges, Mads Mikkelsen as the shadowy antagonist Cliff, and cameos from Hollywood directors like Edgar Wright and Guillermo del Toro. Kojima's auteur ambitions are encoded into the game and its critical reception. While video game review site IGN gave Death Stranding a relatively mediocre 6.8 out of 10, praising its fascinating, fleshed-out world of supernatural fiction and sprawling and spectacular map, but ultimately damning its overly stubborn movement controls, they also released a series of videos where directors J.J. Abrams, George Miller, and Mamoru Oshii praise Kojima as a creative force who at last brings the rigor and artistry of filmmaking to video games. If you play Death Stranding, you will notice that it teems with cameos to prominent men as diverse as late-night host Conan O'Brien, horror icon Junji Ito, and fashion designer Errolson Hugh, but it is starkly empty of cameos from women creators in any field. Instead, at Death Stranding's end, I am struck by how Kojima's love letter to auteurship presents us with a world where men birth the future, while its women leave no legacy behind.